These candidates are going to come together and unify in Cleveland and get behind that nominee. Join us!
Cleveland will burn. Cleveland will burn.
A little birdie told me you are on your way to Cleveland, Ohio.
For this episode of Left Out,
we're going to Cleveland, Ohio.
So welcome back to another episode of Left Out. My name is Mike Palmieri. I'm the radio syndication manager for Democracy at Work and recent graduate of the New Schools program in international affairs.
And I'm Dante Della Valle, recent graduate of the College of Social Sciences and Humanities at Montclair State University.
So Left Out is brought to you by Democracy at Work, an economic justice organization that strives to advocate for alternative solutions to the current model of capitalism. To get a better understanding of what we do, visit our website, democracyatwork.info. There's also some great news, Dante, if you want to share.
Oh yeah, you can find Left Out now on iTunes and Google Play. So we're pretty much everywhere.
Yeah, we're out there. Find us,
You have
please.
no excuse not to listen to us.
Subscribe.
Now. Please do.
Okay, so this segment that's leading us to Cleveland is kind of following, dovetailing with what's going on in the news now. As a lot of you know, we have the Republican convention, which should be pretty interesting.
Very
Dante.
interesting indeed.
And also, maybe for better, bit rosier news, is the fact that Cleveland is bringing home a championship to that city.
Cleveland Cavs.
Yeah,
baby.
the Cavs finally breaking that nearly half-century drought of championships.
Yes. So it's an exciting time for Cleveland indeed.
Yeah.
And going back to the Republican convention and just this primary in general, you see these politicians in states like Ohio and in cities like Cleveland talk about bringing back good paying jobs. They talk about job growth and the economy. These spaces like Cleveland, Detroit, Youngstown, Ohio, they're high poverty, deindustrialized spaces. They've been struggling for a long time. They really mark the transformations that have been happening in our economy over the last half century or so.
Thought it would kind of be pertinent now, today, with politicians kind of returning back home with all this rhetoric, right, about trying to transform the economy for the better, as well as this kind of heightened feeling of a brighter future that's stemming from the sports world. Kind of combine it together, and we found this space where those two things kind of mix a little bit.
I would say that's a great way to describe it, Mike. So these issues, these economic issues pertinent to all our lives, these are things that you, our supporters and listeners of Democracy at Work programs, care deeply about, as do we. And we know this from the number of emails that are sent that we get from you, and we thank you for being responsive to the show and to what we do. And we wanted to bring our listeners into the conversation by really highlighting what we at Democracy at Work advocate for, and that's workers-owned enterprises, right? Democratizing the workplace.
There's more and more questions now when people understand the economic theory that we're presenting is now a question of, well, where is this happening practically? And we have a pretty great example here right out of Cleveland, called the Evergreen Cooperative Initiative. And this is for all you listeners out there who want to be able to kind of dig deeper and see what's going on and see a model in action.
Yeah, and it's really another reason to look at Cleveland, right?
Yeah.
So like you'll hear Cleveland in the news for this Republican National Convention, for the Cavs victory. And it's all pertinent, it's all relevant. But this is another reason that we should be looking at Cleveland, and it's the Cleveland Evergreen Cooperative Initiative. So what is it, Mike? What's the Cleveland Evergreen Cooperative Initiative?
Well, it's interesting. It was designed as an initiative, really, to be an alternative economic development strategy that, rather than using, tax abatements or huge subsidies to bring in a company, was more rooted in the community and grounded. And the idea was kind of, we'll get through it, but partnering using a worker-controlled cooperatives at the center, along with nonprofits, government, private institutions. It's this kind of huge model that's being put together. So we got in touch with someone from Evergreen, And so we had him, speak a little bit about what the initiative was and kind of the ideas and goals it had.
My name is John McMicken. I'm the CEO of the Evergreen Cooperative Corporation in Cleveland, Ohio. Roughly about 10 years ago, step one in the process that led towards the launch and evolution of Evergreen was really the formation of what is now being referred to as the Greater University Circle Initiative. And so this was a multi-pronged approach at addressing a variety of different issues, poverty-related, transportation-related, job-related issues in what was determined to be some of the most distressed neighborhoods in and around Cleveland, which is now being defined as this Greater University Circle area.
So I think it's important to explain a little bit about this area, this particular area in Cleveland itself called the Greater University Circle area. So it includes 6 low-income neighborhoods. There's about 43,000 residents in the Greater University Circle, and they have a median household income of about $18,500. So it's a very poor, impoverished area. It's at the heart of what people refer to as a Rust Belt city. That is, deindustrialized, poverty-stricken, and it really exemplifies the types of transformations to the overall U.S. economy in the last 40 or so years, right?
Yeah, and again, before we go into the way the model's structured and all the great work that we're doing, it probably makes sense putting Cleveland in particular in context.
Yes.
A recent report done by the Brookings Institution found Cleveland's actually top 10 in concentrated poverty, with nearly 28.2% of Greater Cleveland's poor residents living in extremely impoverished neighborhoods.
And another part of this story, from a huge effect of deindustrialization is the population decrease, right? So between 1970 and 2013, Cleveland lost about half of its population, tumbling from 10th to the 45th on the list of the largest U.S. cities. Now that's extraordinary.
Yeah.
915,000 people in about 1970 to below 400,000. That's more than half of its population leaving in the last 40 years.
Yeah,
It's remarkable.
And of course, during that whole period, it used to be a city that had many Fortune 500 companies that called it home and left. What that does to the tax base, how it decimates community was actually something we talked about in our last episode.
We did. We touched on that in the episode about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, on the recent history of free trade and what these quote unquote free trade agreements have really done, especially to Rust Belt cities such as Cleveland, Youngstown, Detroit, and so on.
And so I think, when we kind of go through that, it's easy to have this feeling that these places are hopeless, kind of beyond repair, stuck in a situation, and, something that you don't see any kind of future in sight.
So again, when you think about these deindustrial spaces as being potential grounds for transformative ideas, and this is really what I was interested in, is how do new ideas emerge within what many people would perceive as spaces within a community that should not be producing new ideas, right? They should just be hanging on and surviving. They shouldn't be producing like. And in this case, the Evergreen Cooperative, this was about a new idea that was emerging, and emerging in such a way that was engaging these loose spaces. So what I try to think about is, how do new ideas even come into being?
And that was Professor Nicholas Singali.
I am an associate professor at Cleveland State University and the director of the Masters of Public Administration program there.
We came across him while researching the Evergreen. He had a wonderful paper entitled Loose Change in Governance, and it really helped us understand how a city like Cleveland was really ripe for an initiative such as the Evergreen Initiative, right?
Yeah, I mean, he looks at, and I think this is so important, he looks at cities differently than many other people, in that in those empty houses, those vacant lots, all those negative aspects of industrialization, to him, I mean, he sees them for what they are, but he also, behind that, sees them as areas of possible change.
Cities like Cleveland have gone through these economic downturns, and really we're in the midst of an economic downturn in Cleveland for the past 35, 40 years. And what's this done? What's it look like? So when you go to Cleveland, it's not like the entire city is wiped out. And I know sometimes the image of this can be that this total destruction, almost like the images that people have portrayed about Detroit. But in reality, what you have is a loosening up of the fabric of the city, the conditions of the city. So you still have these junctures within the city in which things are happening. You have economic development taking place, exciting things taking place. For example, in Cleveland, we have a tremendous amount of activity happening around the medical field. We have university hospitals and the Cleveland Foundation, and there's a lot happening with Case Western Reserve, and there's a lot happening within that node. But you go several streets away, and all of a sudden you see this loosening up of the fabric. And what I mean by that is you see vacant homes, you see vacant buildings.
So he went on to explain that even though this type of devastation that Cleveland was ensnared in because of the trends in the economy, the deindustrialization, the outsourcing of jobs, there are still institutions, big institutions, job producing, viable economic institutions that were left behind, that were built up from their golden years, so to speak. So you have the university hospitals, you have schools such as Case Western Reserve University, and then you have, these local nonprofits and foundations such as the Cleveland Foundation, right? Mm-hmm. And at the same time, you can walk just a couple blocks away from them and see the types of like the vacant lots, the foreclosed homes in the city.
Think of it as a cloth in some ways, in which there's this loosening of the cloth. There's these holes or these gaps within the cloth. And these gaps create what I refer to as this loose space.
It's in these spaces that change is possible. And interestingly, he made the point with Cleveland, is that these loose spaces are providing space for change more than, say, a more progressive city that is built up, that has kind of a tight development structure to it.
In legacy cities, we tend to have this loose space that's in place, this availability of space. At the same time, because there is a loss of jobs and a loss of population, there is not as much of a stream of income that's coming into the city to run the city. So what you have is this loosening of administration in all forms. You have a loose governmental administration. You, in some ways, have this loose business administration. And again, this is not saying they're not doing anything. They're actually focused on things, but they're focused on where those nodes are taking place, where they intersect, where the development is occurring. They're not necessarily focusing as much on the loose space. So you have this loosening of the administrative approach that's in place. So you've got these loose spaces that are kind of mixed with this loose governance approach of doing things. And so this introduces that things still have to get done within these cities.
So when you have this unutilized, or what Zingali was calling, loose fabric of spaces, a governance structure like this, something interesting happens.
The governing tends to move outside of the realm of traditional administration, and in fact, outside of the realm, oftentimes, of traditional power structures. And what you start to see is people beginning to govern and get things done in their own way, oftentimes at the ground level or at the street level way. And they do this through networks of community.
But it's also important to keep in mind that simply having these undeveloped loose spaces and this loose governance structure, it's not going to necessarily lead to any kind of change. There's a third component, and it's the very way that we think about and analyze the world. It's what Zingali refers to as doxa.
When you think about doxa, this is Bourdieu's term.
Pierre Bourdieu was a very influential French sociologist and public intellectual of the 20th century.
And this doxa, we can begin to think about as our fundamental understandings that allow us to fit in, that allow our ideas, that allow our concepts to fit in. I mean, we need these doxas, otherwise we break down. We can't even function throughout our day. So much of what we do in our day we're not consciously aware of. We kind of move through our day. But what Bourdieu said is that doxa is kind of what fundamentally pins us down or provides this structure for us to begin to understand some things.
I mean, for example, Cleveland and what we term Rust Belt cities, even in their very name, demonstrate how deeply our understanding of the position in the American economy is pinned down. Mm-hmm. We see them as once strong, productive, working class right? Kind of operating as an industrial supplier of automotive parts and kind of the center of the steel industry.
Yeah, absolutely. We can even see this doxa, right, operating in the way that we respond to this decline, right? You see these Republicans and Democrats alike, just politicians across the board talking about bringing jobs back home. Which isn't
a bad thing in itself, right?
It's definitely not a bad thing in itself, but it really reinforces how we think about the term doxa as restricting our possibilities for change, right? Mm-hmm. Is that we look towards the past and not towards the future. And with that said, the question therefore becomes, how do cities like Cleveland especially begin to move past this restrictive doxa, this restraint on our ability to look forward? Instead of reimagining the past and the rules associated with it, we need to start recreating a future.
People equate capitalism as the fertile ground in which new ideas can develop. What I'm tending to think about here is that what happens when we begin to think about new ideas that transform the way in which we conceptualize rules, that begin to think about something on a different platform than we normally would operate on. And when we start to think about things in this regard, we open up our minds to start playing around with new ideas, things that can fundamentally change the way we're thinking about things, and the way that things can be connected in a different way. Now, I'm not saying that the Evergreen Cooperative has gotten to this kind of transformative new idea, but it certainly shows pieces of this that are taking place that get us to think about what ought to be the role of the rules that we're playing with, and which of those rules can we begin to leave behind to be able to create space or ideas for kind of new rules and new ideas and concepts to emerge. So when we think about these concepts in regards to the Evergreen Cooperative, we think about a relatively new idea that emerged that really didn't fundamentally shift the rules, but it certainly shook up the rules.
And you can see this reimagining, right? This openness to new ideas for those involved in the Evergreen Initiative, taking the form early on of them going and visiting an already successful example of local development based on cooperatives, namely that of the Mondragon Corporation in the Basque region of Spain. For those of you who don't know, kind of very quick history of it, it's a cooperative, started as a single cooperative in the 1950s, and then over the course of decades today is now a federation of nearly over 100 cooperatives and has 85,000 workers, making it the 7th largest corporation in Spain.
And that's a really interesting point. When people think about cooperatives generally, they think of these small grassroots organizations, right? You know, starting with a couple, maybe 10 workers.
Yeah.
At that, and
which they do start, but they can grow.
Absolutely, they can grow. And I think Mondragon, looking to Mondragon as Cleveland and Evergreen did, is really interesting.
Yeah. But Cleveland is not Mondragon.
No.
And we're going to get to that. Very much different.
Okay.
People in the Evergreen model got very interested in Mondragon because it demonstrated some possibilities. But it's, in fact, when you look at the structure of it, was more an inspiration to suggest that people could do something new in a cooperative form. And I think that's by far the most important demonstration project aspect of it.
That was Gar Alperovitz, founding principal of the Democracy Collaborative, and the Lionel R. Ballman Professor of Political Economy at the University of Maryland. He's written extensively on economics, specifically what a post-capitalist future may look like. I think the important thing to point out is that Evergreen Co-op isn't what people would like to think of as your run-of-the-mill worker cooperative. Right?
How so?
Well, it's based on a network with many different nodes of power, which we can get into, and we will get into that later on, right? But the important thing for now is just to get a feel for how it's structured.
Evergreen Cooperative Corporation, which is which is the only nonprofit 501c3 entity in the mix, essentially sits at the top as a bit of an umbrella over the rest of the business units or the worker-owned cooperatives.
So first, there's the Evergreen Cooperative Laundry Facility.
It's a LEED Gold rated commercial laundry facility, so we spent a lot of time and investment early on in making this facility as energy efficient and as environmentally friendly as possible. So we use less water, less natural gas to heat that water than, say, some of our competitors because of the design that went into the facility early on. It is an operation that provides 7-day-a-week service, pickup and delivery service to primarily healthcare facilities, nursing homes, and the hospitality industry. It has a capacity to process approximately 10 million pounds of commercial linen each year. Today sits at about 75% capacity and now has about 45 full-time employees there.
Secondly, you have the Evergreen Energy Solutions, which followed in 2009.
Which was initially focused on commercial solar panel installation, so we began to build solar arrays around town. We have about 2.5 megawatts in service today, but since its launch, we have diversified quite significantly. We do more LED lighting retrofits and some other energy efficiency type work than we do solar panel installation, which has been great because it has helped us grow. It has helped us add more jobs, so we're up to about 25 full-time employees there.
And you have Green City Growers, which opened in 2013.
It's a 3.25-acre hydroponic facility that was designed and built to grow primarily lettuces, leafy greens, and herbs. And it has experienced some significant growth here just in the last year or so. 2015 was a very explosive year for the facility. We have 38 full-time employees, and because of the growth, we're continuing to add new full-time positions and project to be closer to 45 full-time jobs by the end of 2016.
And each one of these cooperatives really emphasizes ecological sustainability into their program, hence the name Evergreen, right?
But, and this is important here, they are not simply standalone co-ops. Rather, they're tied to the community, not in the implicit way that many cooperatives are, but in an explicit fashion.
So if you look at the Cleveland work, these are really basically ordinary worker-owned co-ops in one form or another, linked together, and this is what's different from Mondragon and different from other structures, by a neighborhood-owned nonprofit corporation. So this is community building, not simply worker ownership per se. It is a linkage of cooperatives that are part and parcel of a nonprofit corporation which is aimed at building the community as a whole. And that's not Mondragon, it's not co-ops, it's a new model, and I think very important model because it has that dual joint worker community nature.
And it's also really important to note here that in addition to being tied to the Evergreen Cooperative Corporation, the cooperatives also pay a certain amount of the profits they make into a fund, namely the Evergreen Development Fund, right? And this money will eventually be used to develop new cooperatives and allow the ECC to depend less on outside funding sources.
Now, it's a first sketch, and I'm sure we're going to have to see a lot more experimentations to develop and refine it. But it does open that door, and it drew, I think, on Mondragon for inspiration that you could do something significant at this scale, more than anything else.
There's also a third part to the structure, right? So you have the cooperatives, you have ECC, but the third one, which is absolutely central to it, and what makes the Evergreen Initiative so novel is the presence and usage of anchor institutions.
What are anchor institutions?
Yeah, remember when we were talking to Professor Zingali, kind of mentioned it earlier on?
Okay.
Now, anchor institutions in the literature, as well as in the Cleveland area, are relatively large institutions that shape the activities that are happening around them. They oftentimes are large, either job producing or economic producing entities for the community in which they reside. In this case, there were 3 or 4 kind of primary entities that were already involved with the university circle. So they were already anchored in the university circle.
So you have the Cleveland Foundation, you have the hospitals, you have the universities. I see now. Mm-hmm.
The only shift was to get them anchored or interested in the Evergreen Cooperative Initiative. So they were already there. We pulled those anchor institutions over. Cleveland Foundation pulled those anchor institutions over, got some money from them as well as upfronted money themselves to be able to have the capital to start to build this Evergreen Cooperative. So this activity was extremely necessary to get such a relatively large-scale initiative underway in a relatively low-resource type of environment.
So the relationship between Evergreen and the anchor institutions is, as you would expect, pretty interesting.
And then the relationship with the anchors is really twofold, I guess. The anchors continue to be very, very involved from a leadership and advisory capacity. So leadership from those anchors at the executive level continue to serve on one or more of the various boards that govern these entities.
The first role they play is one of leadership in terms of administration, financing, and so on.
And then the other capacity is they're all customers of all 3 businesses. And so part of the high-level strategy early on was diverting some of the procurement from those organizations to the extent possible to at least help launch these businesses and perhaps mitigate some of the risks associated with traditional startup where there are no customers out of the gate. And so that's really the 2 primary roles that the anchors have served and continue to serve today.
And secondly, the anchor institutions play a really vital role for these cooperatives, which is providing the procurement, the contracts, that is, for the services that they provide. It really provides a kind of protection from the volatility of the market, especially for new startups, such as the 3 cooperatives at Evergreen are. So to sum up, these anchor institutions are pretty vital to this entire project. They're really central to the Evergreen Initiative, right? Because it allowed these cooperatives to overcome the 3 major hurdles that cooperatives normally face. That's finding startup capital, right? And it's overcoming the market barriers, right? Acting as institutions for the procurement of contracts. And it allowed the initiative to scale quickly, right? And since these institutions, like we said, are rooted in the community, hence the name anchor institutions, they literally cannot get up and leave. Unlike the manufacturing companies, the hospitals, universities, and the cultural institutions cannot be outsourced. And that's really central to this entire idea. What's the matter?
No, nothing. I'm good.
You're making a face.
I don't know. I'm fine.
No, say what you're going to say, Mike.
No, it just doesn't sound like a worker cooperative.
Well, what do you mean?
I mean, when I think of worker cooperatives, I think of, like you said, 10 people getting together, having a certain idea or product or a service they want to provide, and they come together, they form their bylaws, they go out, they find who's going to be purchasing their goods. This almost seems the reverse, right? Usually it's more like bottom up.
Well, I guess,
but this time it's like top down.
I guess you're right. It isn't a traditional worker cooperative.
So we refer to it as a multi-stakeholder approach, and so you described it fairly well in terms of how it was essentially assembled and launched. You had philanthropy at the table, you had anchor institutions at the table, you had the city of Cleveland at the table. So the mayor's office and the economic development office very, very involved from design of Evergreen to and continues to be involved today. So you've got the municipality, you've got anchor institutions, you've got philanthropy, all at the table, pulling on the same side of the rope, so to speak, in an effort to launch successful businesses that could then support a worker-owned cooperative.
So what distinguishes this type of approach to the Evergreen Cooperative from what you would think of as a normal cooperative is this multi-stakeholder approach. You know, you have these different institutions, as Zingali said in the beginning, this different network of institutions working together in unison to try to promote this type of local development initiative. Ted Howard, a colleague of Gar Alperovitz at the Democracy Collaborative and a former fellow of the Cleveland Foundation, encapsulated the Evergreen Initiative when he said back in 2010 at the U.S. Federation for Workers Cooperatives Conference that, quote, "It is part of a broader economic development strategy. It's not just to build co-ops. It's to revitalize, stabilize, and transform a very large part of Cleveland, Ohio."
Yeah, I can say it.
Okay.
I can say it. I'm not that I'm critical, but seeing it as a broader development strategy and not just, let's form cooperatives, I get that. It makes sense. But it does still kind of leave this question about top-down power. But when I was doing the research about, comparing what someone working at a evergreen cooperative would be able to access as compared to a private business, there was definitely a huge difference.
Yeah.
Right. So with Evergreen, after a 1-year eligibility period, which a lot of cooperatives have, it's actually, it's a period in time where all your fellow workers will see how you work, decide if you should become a member and should be able to have access to all the different benefits. So after that 1-year period, workers will then vote on accepting you as a new member to the cooperative. And once you become a new member, you're now able to purchase equity in the cooperative through a payroll deduction, which makes you an owner of that,
essentially,
of that company. But then also, if the company runs at a profit, those can be distributed at the end of the fiscal year as a cash bonus.
So it does sound kind of like, despite the top-down approach to when it got started, it does have that inclusiveness. Distinguishes cooperatives from your private business.
It follows the internal structure of the cooperatives follow the main tenets and principles of cooperative structures by all means. But then there's also additional benefits as well.
Evergreen continues to focus on really what we deem to be, at the top of the market or one of the most competitive kind of overall compensation packages. So starting with living wage salaries, fully subsidized healthcare premiums for cooperative members, access to a lot of unique training, and so I think a lot of the training we do isn't necessarily training that you would find at similar small businesses.
So I think it's important to stop here for a second, right, Mike, and emphasize the significance of training at the Evergreen Initiative and just cooperatives more generally.
Training-wise, it comes in a couple of different forms that I think are, fairly unique to, maybe not unique to cooperatives in general, but certainly unique to small businesses. But there's a round of training associated with simply what it means to be a worker owner in a cooperative. What does that mean exactly, and where do I have voting rights? Where do I have a say? Where do I not have a say? A lot of training around the delineation between being both an employee and an owner, because those are two different things. So we all talk about wearing those two different hats, and how that line is drawn. Because we share financial information with the worker owners, there's a lot of training around that aspect of transparency, understanding the basics of a profit and loss statement and a balance sheet and the critical components of the financial picture. So I think that's pretty key. And then there's training around holding a board seat, because each of our boards are seated by a minimum of two of the worker owners, and so training both before and after taking that board seat as to what that role and responsibility looks like. So there's quite a bit of that that's constantly going on top of the business specific training, which is pretty burdensome but necessary as well.
And I think this is just so important, right? Because again, all you listeners out there, everyone who writes in, I mean, one of those questions is, how can someone who was never an owner, who was always identified as being a worker their whole life, be able to then suddenly become a worker owner? And the answer is not overnight, right? Through training, through these different programs. And, Evergreen puts that there as a blueprint to just understand that, yeah, it doesn't happen overnight. Absolutely not. And we never say that it would. And I think this just kind of demonstrates that.
I think you're absolutely right. And you know what? A last interesting part of this Evergreen Initiative, and something that cities distraught by population decreases and foreclosures on homes really need, is this very innovative housing program that they offer.
The housing program.
Yeah.
I think the housing program is a huge benefit, very, very unique. The ability for our employees to purchase their own home that they will pay for via payroll deduction and own outright in 5 years or less. An incredible program. We've had 20 employees who have purchased homes thus far, some of whom are getting close to their 5-year payout mark, and will no longer have a mortgage. And so I think we're certainly gonna celebrate that day.
The Evergreen Initiative, it's really such an important development, not only for Cleveland, but in general, for paradigms of looking at how we can alternatively spark local development, right? It's a new model for local development initiatives across the country. And we should indeed be looking towards it when we're really envisioning this new future of community building and wealth building within communities, especially for these communities that have been neglected in the aftermath of these economic changes that have been happening over the last half century or so.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. But no, absolutely. But I just feel like with anything, let's not romanticize it, right?
Okay.
I mean, there were some significant challenges and shortfalls that had to be dealt with and that are dealt with. And I think that we can learn a lot from what they got right. I think we can learn equally as much from what they got wrong.
In terms of challenges, I mean, all of those businesses came along with significant challenges. We learned a lot about the specifics of running what are fairly complex operations, and also certainly mistakes and oversights and assumptions that didn't prove true.
So the assumptions that he's referencing are actually predictions that were made early on in the initiative, that $65,000 of employee equity per employee would be achieved by 7 years of working. They also forecasted that 10 cooperatives would be created and that they'd be able to generate nearly 500 jobs.
And what is it at currently?
Well, the businesses have only recently become profitable.
Okay.
So that's something that happened. But then also the amount of money that was being made, which affected the amount of wages being paid out, which affected the payroll deduction for the equity, hasn't been reached either. And then currently, in terms of employment, there's just over 100 employees, about 125 now, between the three cooperatives
so
currently
we have to
functioning.
keep in mind that it is a process.
Yeah. No, absolutely. It's just, like with any business, I mean, you make goals and assumptions, and you try to lead up to that, and sometimes you may not reach that. I think the important part is to not continue down that same path and just assume that something different will happen. And Evergreen didn't do that, right?
No, they were very proactive about the problems that they faced.
They made a lot of different changes to deal with these things.
Yeah.
But then there's also the issue, the anchor institutions. So yeah, the initiative's founders relied heavily on the idea that they would be able to get contracts from surrounding institutions.
Yeah, like the anchor institutions.
Yeah. So the anchor institutions, they would be one providing capital, but then also being the customers. But the anchors like Cleveland Clinic, Case Western, Reserve University, and University Hospitals ended up not signing with Evergreen Cooperative Laundry as soon as they would expect, because they already had existing obligations with other companies.
Oh, yeah.
And this kind of pushed down the steady workflow that
they were expecting.
Yeah, that the cooperatives were expecting, exactly. Yeah. So with that said, later down the line, they would eventually obtain contracts, which led to another problem, which is kind of interesting, that of scale.
We now know that we didn't necessarily scale the operation adequately, in that today, now that the hospitals are ready to begin to divert linen services to us, which they have done at some level, we now are already running into capacity issues. So we're facing the tough challenge associated with either expansion or relocation We essentially built a medium-sized facility. We could have gone smaller and had a different market approach, or we could have gone larger in anticipation of one day arriving at the point where we are today, which is the potential associated with taking on large volumes of business with our larger anchors. So good problem to have, but one we're going to have to solve nonetheless.
And I believe, right, there is actually another issue presented with Evergreen Energy Solutions, right?
Yes.
Challenges with Evergreen Energy Solutions, I sort of already alluded to those. There wasn't enough steady volume of commercial solar panel installation as we had originally anticipated, and so therefore we experienced a few years of sort of volatility relative to staffing and the size of that business. So we'd go from 35 employees to 20 to 10, back up to 20, back up to 30, and it just wasn't a very good way to run a business, and certainly was not conducive in any way to building a worker-owned cooperative. And so there lies the need for the diversification that we had to undergo, and which brought about challenges associated with training, because now we do commercial painting, we do residential renovation, we're doing top-to-bottom renovation of homes in the various neighborhoods where we focus, and now LED lighting.
And then finally, there's Green City Growers.
Green City Growers, it's just a very complex environment. Attempting to grow high quality produce year round in the climate that we have in Northeast Ohio, has just proven to be both a challenge and quite an expense. I mean, so operationally the facility has always run really, really well, from day one. We just didn't have the sales to keep up with the year-round production that's needed to essentially cover the overhead around the year. And so only recently, or in the last 12 months, did we finally see the type of sales trend that we really needed from day one to basically fill the place up, because an operation like this one only sees, measurable profit margins when it's essentially full or pretty close to full.
So they were presented with these problems, but most of these problems are problems that any, normal startup, cooperative or otherwise would have to deal with, right?
No. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, it's questions of being able to get consumers. It's questions of being, knowing how large you want your business to be.
Becoming solvent.
Yeah, to become solvent. Absolutely. But, I mean, there are specific problems that relate to the Evergreen model itself.
The way that this cooperative came into being, which in essence was a high resource initiative in a relatively low resource environment, was at the Cleveland Foundation up front of the money. Now, this is quite a bit different than what we normally see with how cooperatives develop. Normally, cooperatives develop from the ground up. In this case, this cooperative had money at the beginning, and it was being established and devised from the top down. Now, this model has also created, I think, some of their ongoing challenges. Because it was built in some ways using a traditional model of top-down, even though it's a cooperative in which the workers have say and ownership stake, one person, one vote, and the direction the organization is moving, one of their largest challenges is to get the workers themselves to embrace their role as not just workers, but as folks that are involved with the ownership of the cooperative. And this has been an ongoing challenge. And I think a residual of the top-down approach that was actually made. And so to me, this is when I spoke to the folks at Evergreen, as well as folks at the Cleveland Foundation, they saw this as their single largest challenge moving forward, was to get the workers, to get the folks that were working there to understand their role within a cooperative enterprise, as opposed to what they conceptualize as just being a regular employee of an organization collecting a paycheck.
And when I posed this kind of similar question to John McMicken at Evergreen Cooperative Corporation, he was pretty open about the issue, and he stated that there were reasons for doing it this way.
I think it's safe to say that Evergreen is a bit unique, at least relative to my exposure to other cooperatives around the country and around the world, for that matter. So We refer to it as a bit of a phased approach. We're sort of in phase one still, although even within Evergreen, all three cooperatives are very different for different reasons. So culturally and answering specific questions about how the cooperatives work, I mean, even that varies slightly from one to the next. But for the most part, we continue to be in what we refer to as phase one, where there is more control from the business office side of things today than there ultimately will be once we hit phase two, which is to essentially turn these cooperatives loose. They're independently structured companies for a reason. They need to be at some point in time standalone entities, and that happens when they are no longer relying on any outside funding to speak of for either working capital related purposes or growth and expansion related purposes. So we really felt like it was important to overlay a fairly tight governance structure for many reasons, certainly to ensure the success out of startups. So many small businesses, fail out of the gate without that kind of oversight and governance, and also because there was a lot of funding flowing into this initiative. So you had a lot of individuals, institutions, and foundations who were very, very passionate about the goals and objectives and the mission, but also wanted and needed some oversight on the financial management side of these businesses, because so much money came in originally to get them launched.
The really interesting point that I see in all of this are the contradictions and the juxtapositions within the Evergreen project.
What do you mean?
Right? Like when we're talking to Singali about the loose space and governance, but it also giving rise to a structure that was very tightly governed.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
And these old deindustrialized spaces are now that were once a symbol of the old rules, right? The old doxa gives rise to something completely new.
No, absolutely. Something completely new. And then there's also, I mean, I'm sorry if I'm beating this horse, but then there's also the fact that what makes Evergreen so innovative and new in terms of its structures is also one of its fundamental challenges. I mean, I think with all that, right, with all its bumps and bruises, for everyone here who's looking and thinking and working to build an alternative economic system in which worker ownership is central, we have to realize that challenges similar to Evergreen are always going to arise, right? Yeah. But they shouldn't be demoralizing. I mean, they should be embraced. They should be worked through. Because in the end, that's kind of what Evergreen is. It's a challenge to conventional community building, to conventional business models, and to borrow Professor Zingali's term, to traditional doxa.
I mean, we're very proud of the 125 or so jobs that we've created and sustained thus far, but clearly to really move the needle, we know we need to do more. We need to do more here, and we hope to do more elsewhere by really fine-tuning this model that could then be, more readily replicated and perhaps faster, than we really feel like we've paid the price. We've taken a lot of bumps and bruises along the way, and we hope that that'll bring a lot of value to our next effort, as well as somebody else's similar effort that perhaps takes place, outside of this zip code.
The lessons are that you want to do this, be prepared to do it and understand how difficult it is, but also understand the potential payoff as more and more people learn how to do more and more of this and become more and more sophisticated about it. The Evergreen model was the first one of its kind. So it had to learn how to solve problems that had never been even posed before. And it's I think very impressive in its achievements, given how challenging it's been.
And I think that what Professor Zingali said towards the end of our conversation with him, he really points out that the achievements of Evergreen go beyond what we would traditionally use to measure a successful business, right?
Mm-hmm. What this thing has done is created hope within communities that, in many ways, were lacking hope. I don't know how you put some kind of dollar value to that, but when we begin to think about a community in which there is a lack of hope, this leads to all kinds of other social problems that we run into. It leads to kids making wrong decisions or kids thinking that they're going nowhere. It leads to families that potentially break down. It leads to possible, increases in crime. So when you begin to instill hope within a community, you start to see people beginning to think about reaching their full potential. So the last time that I was at Evergreen Cooperative, Evergreen routinely does these tours, and sometimes I will hop in and kind of see these tours. So around, I don't know, I think it's 8-9 months ago, I was in there again, and I just went on one of these tours. And the person that was leading the tour was somebody that several years ago was basically unemployed and didn't know the first thing about hydroponic gardening. And this person was leading the tour of people who are interested in what it is that they do there at the Evergreen Cooperative. This person was teaching other folks. Now, how do you put value to that? I mean, it's tremendous value to me, and I think it's tremendous value to other traditional frames of how we put kind of capital value to that or some kind of monetary value to that. It falls way short. So when you think about the Evergreen Cooperative as an initiative to instill hope and to drive a community forward in that way, I think it's been a tremendous success. Is it inking out everything we hope it to ink out with on paper for a financial basis? Not so much yet, and let's hope it gets there. But this is where it's at today.
And I think another, really a measure of not just the Evergreen itself, but the model that they're creating there in Cleveland, it speaks to its success, the fact that this model is beginning to be embraced in other towns and cities across the country.
There's a lot of interest in it around the country. I think probably there's one is in Richmond, Virginia, that you might check out that's beginning to develop in that direction. Rochester, New York, commissioned a study of how to do it and is now taking the next step on the studies published on their website on how to do it in the entire city, which is a small city rather than a neighborhood. Is another place. Some of our staff have been talking with a number of people in Albuquerque and then also in Oakland. Richmond, California also had some experimentation with this. So there's Atlanta as well, a much smaller scale one. So there's a lot of interest in it, and some of them, are at the development stage, and some are further along than that and are moving forward.
We're formally engaged currently with the city of Newark, New Jersey, who is very serious about replicating Evergreen or something very, very similar to Evergreen. The mayor there and the economic development arm there, the NCEDC, and they're very interested specifically in a commercial laundry facility, and the leadership team at St. Barnabas is at that table and in those discussions. They seem very committed, and again, our contribution is to share some of our lessons learned as well as some of our specific expertise. We've been engaged with a Native American group out of Portland, Oregon, who is launching and preparing to launch a couple of small businesses that they would like to form as worker-owned cooperatives. We've worked with a group who is planning on a food hub-related business out of Detroit, Michigan. New Orleans is another city with whom we've been in discussions with over the past 12 months or so. Rochester, New York probably rounds out the list.
And so what's happening in Cleveland is very exciting.
It is indeed.
Right? I mean, as any alternative to our current economic model should be.
Yes, absolutely.
So we encourage everyone to share the story of Evergreen with friends, with family, with local politicians,
with whoever,
with activist groups.
Absolutely, please do.
Yeah. So hopefully you enjoyed it, and this is something we're looking to do more of, is to get out there and grab these stories.
Yeah, especially of these workers' self-directed enterprises, these cooperatives, really trying to lend credence to our name and democratize the workplace itself.
We'd like to extend enormous gratitude to Professor Gar Alperovitz and Nicholas Ngali,
as well as John McMicken of the Evergreen Cooperative Corporation, for taking the time, all of them for taking the time to talk with us and lending their insight and their expertise.
Yes. Yeah, without them, the episode would not have been possible.
Absolutely.
If you like what you're hearing, give us a like on Facebook, subscribe to our YouTube channel, Democracy at Work. And of course, we provide this show for free, so if you'd like to support us, Visit the donate page at democracyatwork.info.
Please, and we suggest you visit democracyatwork.info, where in addition to this podcast, Left Out, we also link to reports on the Evergreen Cooperative, on Professor Zingali's paper, and Garo Perovitz, and the work he's doing over at the Democracy Collaborative, which is very important.
And also, again, we are out on iTunes and Google Play, so please subscribe. You'll be able to get these monthly podcasts of Left Out. A couple of special thanks. Shout out to Bloomfield College Creative Arts and Technology Department.
And as always, thank you to our sound engineer team, Anthony Corbo, and of course, Corey Morgar.
And Toriano Gandhi for making it all possible.
Yes, thank you, Toriano Gandhi. This was Left Out.